Support the Amigos podcast and keep the Amiga goodness flowing for just $1 a month. Visit our page at patreon.com/AmigosPodcast.
Amiga, the first personal computer that gives you a creative edge.
Amigos, the podcast about everything Amiga. Amigos is a proud member of the Throwback Network, your home for quality retro podcasts. And now, here are your hosts, Aaron Dowdy and John Bodovkar Schaller.
This is episode 0 of the Amigos podcast. This is our attempt to create a podcast about the Amiga and the games, hardware, and everything about the Amiga computer. My name's John Schaller. My nickname's Bodovkar, and my co-host Aaron, he will pretty much always refer to me as Boat. That's just what he does.
That's true.
My co-host Aaron Dowdy, he is regarded by many as the most learned man of Amiga, probably, if not the world, probably the country.
These men are fools. These men are fools. I know a little.
So he's joining me on this journey. And so, Aaron, why do you think that the Amiga is not kind of trod upon very often in the halls of podcasting?
Well, the Amiga, for starters, it's 30-year-old computer. You don't see a lot of classic computer coverage. You see more now than you did, right? But it's mostly, you see some Apple, some PC. The Amiga gets touched on here and there get on gaming podcasts and whatnot. I'm not sure. I know the Amiga community is still strong. It's mostly Eurocentric. I don't think there are that many people in the United States that are still messing around with them, but there are definitely some. But it certainly is a platform that you can talk about for days and days. It was quirky, it was powerful, it was misunderstood, it was certainly mismarketed, mismanaged. I think with appropriate company behind the technology, the Amiga could be running the show right now instead of being something that's in the ground.
Yeah, I'm coming to this as kind of an Amiga novice. I never had an Amiga growing up. I'm about 10 years younger than Aaron. So he grew up kind of in the heyday. The Amiga was launched 30 years ago today. And Aaron was, how old were you 30 years ago today?
Oh, God. Oh, geez. What's that, 13-ish?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's, if you're an impressionable young mind, looking at the latest and greatest hardware out there, I bet the Amiga, really, really jumped out at you, didn't it?
Well, to be honest, I was a little late to the party. In fact, I was a PC stalwart, believe it or not. I had my Tandy 1000, and I didn't get a dose of the Amiga until I had a friend that had gotten one, and he had some software, and I was pretty impressed just to the sound and the colorful graphics. He had a friend that had a massive Amiga collection, several Amigas, tons and tons of software, some bought, some not. And still, even though I'd seen it, I don't know, I kind of held on to the PC. I thought, well, these things have cool intros and it's got to have good music, but the PC, that's where the real gaming is. Well, not really. I mean, if you consider an 85 or 30 years ago, that'd be, what was that?
85.
85, right. If you consider the kind of PC that was available in 85, you had 4-color graphics, CGA. You had basically a beeper sound, and you had no multitasking. It was a DOS-based system. In some ways, the Amiga blows the PC out of the water just from the standpoint of the fact that you could multitask on it. I remember when I formatted a disk one time and did something else, which I was astounded. I was more impressed with that than I was the gaming at first, just because I didn't know what multitasking was. Something you take for granted today, but back in those days. But I really didn't get into the Amiga until probably oh, let's say 89. I think I got my first Amiga, and then I've had an Amiga with me pretty much ever since.
Yeah, I didn't really ever have any experience using an Amiga until probably high school, which for me was, 10 years after this, maybe 98, 99. And I had a friend that, was real into them. But at that time, if you're looking at, a shooter that has parallax scrolling or something like that, not knowing the history behind the platform, you'd think, well, the Super Nintendo and the Genesis, they do all this stuff, and, what's the Amiga got over it? It wasn't until later when I realized the Amiga was doing this stuff, 5, 6, 7 years before the Super Nintendo or the Genesis was even out. One of the interesting things, I guess, is that the Amiga hardware is similar to the Genesis hardware in such a way that games are easily ported back and forth. And we'll talk about that, I guess, as we start to look at some different ports of different games and stuff. But a lot of games that I enjoyed on the Super Nintendo and the Genesis were actually originally Amiga ports, which is kind of neat.
I think the Genesis was 68,000 base.
Yeah, it was,
and the Amiga was as well. I guess that made porting it easier. I can't imagine them, aside from that, having too much in common, because the Amiga's got a pretty, it's pretty wacky, the chipset on it. But I knew, like you said, I knew that they shared a lot of ports, and I'm assuming the processor was a big reason why.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So with this podcast, we're going to try and follow kind of a pattern set by other podcasts like No Quarter and You Don't Know Flack, and some podcasts that have kind of a set order of doing things, just because I think that makes the podcast flow nicely and it keeps things from getting boring. So we'll introduce each show with some feedback if we ever get any, and then we'll do some current Amiga news. After that, we'll have a kind of a hardware spotlight. Some weeks we'll focus on different computer models, and I know Aaron's got a lot of stories to tell about some of the crazier peripherals that were available for the Amiga.
Oh, yes.
After that, we'll go right into the game, and each week we'll focus on a different game, talk about the history, what made it special, and then we'll end up each episode with a little high score competition for games that have a score. So I think it'll be a good show. I think it'll be enjoyable for people that know a little bit about the Amiga. Hopefully we won't embarrass ourselves too much for those that know a lot about the Amiga. And but just kind of having a podcast in this space is something that I found to be lacking in the podcasting world right now. So Aaron, you have anything else you want to say before we?
No, just I hope everyone enjoys learning about the Amiga, those that don't know much about it, and for those that are incredibly knowledgeable, I beg your forgiveness.
All right, well, this is we're going to go ahead and sign off here, and we'll be back with episode 1 of Amigos, the Amiga podcast.